The porcelain was a whisper of white against her dark skin. Abigail held the teacup, its delicate handle a fragile loop between her thumb and forefinger, and felt the faint warmth of the brew seep through the china. The steam carried the scent of bergamot and something else, something she had added herself. A bitter, earthy smell, masked by the cloying sweetness of jasmine drifting in from the garden. She kept her eyes downcast, fixed on the swirling amber liquid, her face a placid mask she had spent a lifetime perfecting. Around her, the Sunday brunch on the piazza of the Beaumont house unfolded in a lazy tableau of Charleston gentility. The rustle of silk dresses, the low murmur of conversation about cotton prices and the upcoming cotillion, the lazy drone of cicadas and the live oaks draped with Spanish moss. It was a world of serene, suffocating beauty, and she was about to shatter. "Abigail, my tea." The voice was Eleanor Beaumont's, light and musical, yet it coiled in Abigail's gut like a length of rope. She moved without thought, a lifetime of servitude guiding her feet across the polished cypress floorboards. She placed the saucer on the small wrought iron table beside her mistress's wicker chair. Eleanor did not look at her. She never did, not really. Abigail was a function, a pair of hands, a shadow in a linen apron. Eleanor's gaze was fixed on Mrs. Dubois, who was fanning herself languidly and recounting a piece of delicious gossip about the Troupe family. Abigail retreated to her post by the French doors, her back straight, her hands clasped behind her. She watched Eleanor lift the cup. The sunlight caught the gold rim, making it flash. Eleanor's fingers were long and pale, her nails buffed to a soft sheen. Those same fingers had once pointed, accusingly, at a chipped saucer. Those same fingers had signed the bill of sale. The first sip was delicate. Eleanor's lips painted a soft rose, pursed slightly. She paused, her head tilted. A flicker of a frown. "This tea is strong today, Abigail." "My apologies, mistress," Abigail said, her voice a low, even murmur. "I will make a fresh pot." No, it's fine," Eleanor said, waving a dismissive hand. Eager to return to the conversation, she took another, deeper drink. Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird, trapped in a cage of bone. She focused on a point in the garden beyond the piazza, a spray of white jasmine climbing a brick wall. The scent was dizzying, a perfume of death. She had crushed the oleander seeds herself, grinding them to a fine powder with a stone pestle in the quiet of the pre-dawn kitchen. The same seeds grew on the beautiful, deadly bushes that lined the carriageway. Beauty and poison, all tangled together. It was the way of this place. She felt a tremor in her own hands and clasped them tighter. She thought of her daughter, Eliza. She pictured her small face, the gap between her two front teeth, the way her braids would bounce when she ran. She heard her voice, a high, sweet sound, singing the mockingbird lullaby Abigail had taught her. "Hush now, little bird, don't you sing a word, Mama's gonna catch the sun for you." The memory was a physical ache, a phantom limb that throbbed with every beat of her heart. Eleanor had promised. She had stood right here on this piazza, the scent of jasmine thick in the air, and promised Eliza would never be sold. A promise as fragile as a teacup. A few minutes passed. The conversation flowed on. Then, a small cough from Eleanor. She pressed a lace handkerchief to her lips. Her face, usually a mask of powdered composure, seemed to slacken. A bead of sweat trickled from her temple. Master Wallace Beaumont, a portly man with a florid face, paused in his story about a prize stallion. "Are you well, my dear?" Eleanor tried to smile, but it was a grimace. "Just a touch of indigestion." She took a sip of water. Her hand trembled, rattling the glass against her teeth. The other ladies fell silent, their fans ceasing their gentle flutter. The air on the piazza grew still and heavy. Abigail remained by the door, a statue carved from shadows. Her gaze was locked on Eleanor. She saw the subtle shift in her mistress's skin tone, a gray pallor creeping beneath the rouge. She saw the confusion in her eyes, then the dawning fear. Eleanor's hand went to her stomach. She gasped, a sharp, ragged sound that cut through the genteel quiet. "Wallace," she whispered, her voice strained. The teacup slipped from her other hand, falling to the floor with a sharp crack, spilling its dregs across the pristine white tiles. The sound was like a gunshot. Chaos erupted. Wallace leaped to his feet, knocking over his chair. Mrs. Dubois shrieked. The gentleman rushed forward. Abigail did not move. She watched as her master knelt beside his wife, his face a mask of panic. "Eleanor, what is it?" Eleanor's body began to convulse. A violent, shuddering tremor that seemed to rack her from the inside out. Her eyes, wide and terrified, found Abigail's across the crowded piazza. For a single, eternal second, their gazes locked. In that moment, Abigail was no longer a shadow, she was seen. And in Eleanor's eyes, Abigail saw not just pain, not just terror, but a flicker of horrifying understanding. Then the moment was gone. Eleanor's eyes rolled back in her head. A froth of spittle appeared at the corner of her lips. Her body arched in a final, agonizing spasm, and then fell still. The doctor, a portly man named Bellows with breath that smelled of sherry and stale tobacco, arrived in a flurry of black wool and leather. He knelt over Eleanor Beaumont's body, which now lay on a divan in the drawing-room, her fine silk dress disheveled, her face a waxy bluish-gray. Master Wallace paced the Aubusson carpet, his heavy boots scuffing the woven flowers, his face a thunder-cloud of grief and fury. He had already backhanded one of the young houseboys for being too slow with a basin of water. The air in the house was thick with the metallic scent of fear. Abigail stood in the doorway, a silent sentinel, her hands folded over her apron. She had been the one to help carry the mistress inside. She had felt the dead, the weight of the woman who had owned her, body and soul. The contact had sent a jolt through her, cold and final. She had arranged Eleanor's limbs, straightened her dress, and closed her eyes, her touch as gentle and practiced as it had been 1,000 times before. She performed her duties with the seamless perfection of a ghost. Inside, her soul was a frozen, silent thing. Dr. Bellows straightened up, wiping his hands on a handkerchief. He looked at Master Beaumont with a grim expression. "I'm sorry, Wallace. She's gone." "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" Wallace roared, his voice cracking. "It was a seizure. An apoplexy." Bellows shook his head slowly. "The symptoms, the rapidity of it, the convulsions, the discoloration. This was no apoplexy." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I've seen this before, on the islands. It looks like poison." The word hung in the air, venomous and sharp. Poison. Wallace Beaumont froze, his pacing halted. His head swiveled slowly, his eyes sweeping over the assembled house slaves, Abigail, the cook Delia, the young boys Samuel and Peter, who huddled near the hall. His gaze was like a physical weight, hot and full of accusation. "Poison?" he repeated, the word a low growl. He strode over to the divan and stared down at his wife's face. He traced the line of her jaw with a trembling finger. Who would do this? Who would dare? His eyes fell on the small table beside the divan, where the shattered remains of the teacup had been placed on a silver tray. He picked up a shard of porcelain, its edge sharp and lethal. His knuckles were white. His gaze lifted and, once again, found Abigail. "You," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "You served the tea." Abigail met his gaze. Her heart, which had been so still, began its frantic drumming again, but her face remained a mask. "Yes, Master Wallace, as I do every Sunday. Did you taste it? No, master. It is not my place. Did you notice anything unusual about it? She let a flicker of hesitation cross her face, a calculated performance. The mistress, she said it was strong. Wallace's eyes narrowed. He looked from Abigail to Delia, the cook, a large, weary woman who had been on the plantation since she was a girl. Delia, did you make this tea? Yes, master, Delia whispered, her hands twisting in her apron. Same as always. English breakfast. 2 spoons of sugar. Just how she liked it. Wallace turned back to Abigail. He walked towards her, his presence immense, suffocating. He stopped just inches from her, so close she could smell the sweat and rage coming off him. He was studying her face, searching for a crack in the facade. She held her breath, focusing on the crescent-shaped scar on the back of her right hand, a pale, silvery mark against her brown skin. She traced its curve with the thumb of her other hand, a small, secret gesture of self-possession. The scar was a memory, a brand. Eleanor had given it to her years ago, striking her hand with a silver letter opener for being too slow to mend a torn piece of lace. It had been a casual act of cruelty, forgotten by the mistress the moment it was done. But the scar remained, a permanent record. My wife was a good woman, Wallace said, his voice a raw whisper. A saint. She was kind to you people, kinder than you deserved. Abigail said nothing. She knew Eleanor's kindness. It was the kindness of a cat to a mouse it was about to kill. It was a conditional, capricious thing, given and withdrawn on a whim. It was the kindness that promised to keep a mother and child together and then sold the child for the price of a new carriage. I will find who did this, Wallace snarled, his face contorting. I will tear this house apart. I will tear you apart until the devil responsible confesses. He turned away from her, his rage needing a larger canvas. Silas, he bellowed, get in here. Mr. Silas Croft, the overseer, entered from the back porch. He was a lean, sinewy man, with pale, watchful eyes and a perpetually sour expression. He held his wide-brimmed hat in his hands, but his deference was a thin veneer over a core of brutish authority. He surveyed the scene, the body, the weeping master, the terrified slaves, with a cold, appraising glance. Master Beaumont, he said, his voice a dry rasp. My wife has been murdered, Wallace said, his voice thick with a combination of grief and theatrical fury. Poisoned, in my own home, by one of them. He gestured, with a sweeping, contemptuous hand at the house staff. Silas Croft's gaze moved from face to face, lingering for a moment on each one. When his eyes met Abigail's, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool marble floors. Croft saw things other white folk missed. He saw the flicker of defiance behind the mask of submission. He had a sixth sense for rebellion, for the silent, simmering resentments that festered beneath the surface of plantation life. Lock them in the smokehouse, Wallace commanded. All of them. No food, no water. I want the truth by morning. Do you understand me, Silas? I do, sir, Croft replied, a faint, cruel smile touching his lips. I understand perfectly. The smokehouse was a small, windowless brick building behind the main kitchen. The air inside was thick with the lingering, acrid smell of cured ham and years of soot. It was hot, suffocating, and dark as the inside of a coffin. The heavy wooden door slammed shut, the iron bar thudding into place, sealing Abigail, Delia, Samuel, and Peter in the blackness. For a long time no one spoke. The only sounds were the ragged breathing of the 2 young boys and Delia's soft, hiccuping sobs. Abigail stood with her back against the rough brick wall, the grit pressing into her dress. She closed her eyes, but there was no difference between the darkness outside and the darkness within. The image of Eleanor's face, contorted in its final moments, was seared onto the inside of her eyelids. She did not feel guilt. She did not feel remorse. What she felt was a vast, cold emptiness, the quiet that comes after a storm. The act was done. The teacup was won, shattered. Now came the reckoning. It was you, wasn't it? Delia's voice, thick with tears and accusation, cut through the darkness. Abigail didn't answer. She ran her thumb over the crescent scar on her hand. The gesture grounded her, pulled her back from the edge of the abyss that was opening in her mind. "Why, Abigail?" Delia whispered, her voice breaking. "Why would you bring this down on all of us? He's going to kill us. He's going to whip us all to death." The boys, Samuel and Peter, began to cry in earnest, high, terrified sounds that echoed in the small space. "Hush now," Abigail said, her voice surprisingly steady. It was the same tone she had used to soothe Eliza after a nightmare. "Crying won't help us." "Help us?" Delia scoffed, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "There is no help for us now. You've killed us all just as sure as you killed her." Abigail pushed herself off the wall and moved through the darkness toward the sound of Delia's voice. She found her, a large, trembling shape, and placed a hand on her shoulder. Delia flinched. "She sold my Eliza," Abigail said, the words falling like stones into the dark. "She stood on that piazza, smelling of jasmine and lies, and she promised me. She promised. And then she sold my baby girl south. For a new set of chairs, for the parlor. I saw the receipt on the master's desk." A silence fell, deeper than the darkness. Delia's sobbing subsided, replaced by a shuddering breath. The boys quieted, listening. "She took my whole world and traded it for furniture." Abigail continued, her voice a low, chilling monotone. "There is no whipping worse than that. There is no death worse than the one I've already died 100 times since that day." She could feel Delia's shoulders slump in defeat. The anger was gone, replaced by a shared, bottomless grief. Every slave on the Beaumont plantation, every slave in Charleston, in all the South, had a story like that. A broken promise. A stolen child. A life ripped apart for the price of a chair, a horse, a silk dress. Abigail had simply been the one to collect the debt. The hours crawled by. The air grew hotter, thicker. Thirst became a torment. Abigail drifted in and out of a state that was not quite sleep, not quite wakefulness. She was back in the small cabin she had shared with Eliza. She could smell the wood smoke and the scent of her daughter's hair. She was braiding it, her fingers weaving the dark strands, humming the mockingbird lullaby. "If that mockingbird don't sing, Mama's gonna buy you a diamond ring." A foolish promise from a foolish song. She had no diamonds. She had nothing. In her half-dream, the mockingbird in the live oak outside the cabin began to sing. But its song was wrong. It was a distorted, mocking version of the lullaby, interwoven with Eleanor Beaumont's light, cruel laughter. The scent of jasmine filled the cabin, thick and suffocating, choking the air until she couldn't breathe. She woke with a gasp, her heart pounding, the smell of soot and cured meat filling her nostrils. The darkness was absolute, but she could still hear the mockingbird, and she could still smell the jasmine. The door was thrown open in the gray light of dawn. Silas Croft stood silhouetted against the pale sky, a coiled whip in his hand. "Master wants to see you," he said, his pale eyes fixing on Abigail. "Just you." Delia let out a small whimper. Samuel and Peter pressed themselves back against the wall. Abigail rose to her feet. Her legs were stiff. Her mouth was as dry as dust. But she walked toward the light with a straight back and a steady gaze. She knew this was the next step. She had prepared for it. She would not give him the satisfaction of her fear. Croft led her not to the great house, but to the stables. The air here was rich with the smell of hay and horseflesh. Old Thomas, the stable master, was currying a big bay gelding. He was a small, gnarled man, with skin like wrinkled leather, and eyes that had seen too much. He stopped his work as they entered, his gaze meeting Abigail's for a brief, unreadable moment before he looked away, his expression carefully blank. But in that fleeting glance, Abigail saw a flicker of something, pity perhaps, or a warning. Master Wallace Beaumont was waiting for them near the empty carriage stall. He had not slept. His clothes were rumpled, his face was puffy and blotched with red, and his eyes were bloodshot with a mixture of sorrow and burning rage. He held a piece of paper in his hand. "We searched your cabin, Abigail," he said, his voice hoarse. Abigail's blood ran cold. She had been so careful. She had burned the pestle and the small cloth bag she had used to carry the oleander seeds. There was nothing to find. "We found this," Wallace said, holding out the paper. It was a page torn from a book, the edges singed. On it, in a child's clumsy, determined script, were letters. Eliza. Her daughter had been learning to write her name. Abigail had been teaching her in secret, a dangerous, forbidden act. She had kept that single page, a relic of a stolen future, hidden in the straw ticking of her mattress. "My wife taught you to read, didn't she?" Wallace accused, his voice rising. "A mistake. A foolish, sentimental mistake. Gave you ideas. Made you think you were better than your station." "She taught me my letters, master," Abigail said quietly, "so I could read her the Bible." "And what else did you read?" he sneered. "Books on herbs? On poisons?" He crumpled the paper in his fist. "Your girl, Eliza, that's why you did it, isn't it? A petty, savage revenge, because she was sent where she could be of better use." Sumter, better use. The words were a slap. Her daughter, her beautiful, bright-eyed girl, reduced to a calculation of utility. The cold emptiness inside Abigail began to smolder, a single, hot coal of rage. "She was a good mistress to you," Wallace continued, his voice thick with self-pity. "She favored you, dressed you in finer clothes than the others, protected you, and you repaid her with this, with poison, like a snake." He stepped forward, his face inches from hers. "Confess," he hissed. "Confess, and I will make it quick. A hanging, deny it, and I will give you to Mr. Croft. He will take his time. He will peel the skin from your bones until you beg for a death that will not come." Silas Croft shifted his weight, the whip in his hand creaking softly. The sound was full of promise. Abigail looked at the raging, grieving man before her. She saw not a master but a tyrant in pain, a man whose entire world was built on the suffering of others, now shocked and outraged that the suffering had finally touched him. And she knew she would give him nothing, not her fear, not her pain, not her confession. "I did not kill the mistress," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I served her tea, that is all." Wallace's face purpled with rage. "Liar!" he screamed, and he swung, not with his hand, but with the heavy, silver-knobbed cane he carried. The blow caught Abigail on the side of her head. The world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain and then went dark. She woke to the rhythmic creak of leather and the jolting of a cart. The sun was hot on her face. She tried to sit up, but her hands and feet were bound with rough rope. The side of her head throbbed with a blinding pain, and she could feel dried blood matting her hair. She was lying on a bed of straw in the back of a wagon, Silas Croft on the driver's seat, his back to her. They were on the main road, heading away from the Beaumont plantation, away from Charleston. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the fog of her pain. Where were they taking her? To another plantation? To the city jail? To a place in the woods where Croft could work his evil without witnesses? She tested the ropes on her wrists. They were tight, expertly knotted. She lay back, feigning unconsciousness, and watched the world go by through slitted eyelids. Moss-draped oaks, flooded rice fields, the occasional grand house set back from the road. She had to think. She had to find a way. She thought of Eliza. Was this what it had been like for her? Bounced along in a wagon, tied and terrified, being carried away from everything she had ever known. The thought fueled the smoldering coal of her rage, burning away the fear. She had done this for Eliza. She could not fail now. She could not let them win. The mockingbird's song came to her then, not a nightmare version, but the clear, simple melody of the lullaby. It was a thread of memory, a lifeline. "Hush now, little bird. Don't you sing a word." She would be silent. She would be still. She would watch. And she would wait for her chance. She had brought down the mistress of the great house. She would not be undone by a pale-eyed overseer in a dusty wagon. Her thumb found the scar on her hand. The familiar crescent shape was a promise to herself, a promise of survival. They stopped at noon at a dusty, fly-blown crossroads with a single tavern. Croft tethered the horses and went inside, leaving Abigail in the back of the wagon under the brutal sun. Thirst was a fire in her throat. Her head pounded in time with her heart. This was her chance. She worked at the ropes, twisting her wrists, scraping the skin raw against the coarse fibers. The knots were tight, but there was a little give. She strained, pulling until her shoulders screamed in protest. A strand loosened, then another. Her heart hammered with a mixture of hope and terror. She could hear the low murmur of voices from the tavern. Any moment, Croft could return. Her hands came free. She didn't dare stop to rub the circulation back into them. She sat up, her head swimming, and worked on the ropes at her ankles. They were easier. In a moment, she was free. She peered over the side of the wagon. The road stretched in both directions, empty and shimmering in the heat. To her right, a dense thicket of trees and overgrown brush led away from the road, toward what looked like swampland. It was her only hope. She took a deep breath, gathered her torn dress around her, and swung her legs over the side of the wagon. She landed silently in the soft dust of the road. For a second, she froze, listening. The tavern door creaked open. Panic seized her. She didn't wait to see who it was. She ran. She plunged into the thicket. Thorns and branches, tearing at her skin and clothes. She could hear a shout behind her. "Hey, stop!" It was Croft's voice. She ran faster, fueled by adrenaline, crashing through the undergrowth, her bare feet stumbling over roots and stones. The ground grew soft and spongy beneath her feet. The air grew thick and humid, filled with the smell of decay and damp earth. She was in the beginnings of the salt marsh, the low-country swamp. Behind her, she could hear him crashing through the brush after her. He was faster, his legs longer. He was gaining on her. She pushed herself harder, gasping for breath, her lungs burning. The lullaby was a frantic beat in her head. If that mockingbird don't sing. The world around her became a green and brown blur. Cypress knees jutted from the murky water like broken teeth. The air was alive with the hum of insects. She risked a glance over her shoulder. He was closer now, his face a grim mask of determination. She saw a channel of dark, slow-moving water ahead of her, a small bayou. She didn't hesitate, she threw herself into it. The water was shockingly cold, and the muddy bottom sucked at her feet, trying to pull her down. She pushed off, half swimming, half wading across to the other side, the heavy, wet cotton of her dress dragging at her like a shroud. She scrambled up the muddy bank on the other side, gasping, covered in slime and weeds. She looked back. Croft had stopped at the water's edge. He stared at her, his chest heaving, his pale eyes burning with frustration and rage. He wouldn't follow her into the water, not with the snakes and gators that called these places home. "You can't hide forever, witch," he screamed, his voice echoing over the still water. "The Master's put a price on you. Every paddle roller from here to Savannah will be looking for you. You'll die in here." Abigail didn't answer. She turned and melted into the deep shadows of the cypress swamp, leaving him shouting impotently on the opposite bank. She was free. But she was also lost, hunted, and alone in a place as dangerous as any man. As she pushed deeper into the swamp, the sounds of the road faded, replaced by the symphony of the wild, the croak of frogs, the buzz of mosquitoes, the distant cry of a hawk. She was terrified, but for the first time since Eliza was taken, she was the master of her own feet. Each step was her own. Each breath was her own. And in the heart of that terrifying freedom, a strange, fierce hope began to grow. The hunt had begun. The days bled into one another, a fever dream of survival. The swamp was a living entity, both provider and predator. Abigail learned its rhythms, its secrets. She learned which roots were safe to eat, how to find fresh water, how to move silently through the sawgrass and cypress stands. Her knowledge of herbs, once a tool for healing in the plantation infirmary, now became her means of staying alive. She made poultices for her cuts, and a bitter tea from willow bark for the fever that sometimes shook her. Her dress was in tatters, her skin was a crosshatch of scratches and insect bites. She was thinner, harder. The soft edges of the house slave were being stripped away, revealing a core of resilient feral strength she hadn't known she possessed. The crescent scar on her hand, once a mark of shame, now seemed like a warrior's sigil. She would trace it in the dark, a reminder of who she was and what she had done. But she was not entirely alone. The swamp was a sanctuary for others who lived outside the grasp of the master's law. One evening, drawn by the faint smell of wood smoke, she stumbled upon a small, hidden encampment of runaways. They were wary at first, their eyes filled with the hunted suspicion of all fugitives, but an old woman with wise, kind eyes, who they called Mama Juba, took her in. She cleaned Abigail's wounds and gave her a stew made of turtle and wild onions. "You the one from the Beaumont place?" Mama Juba asked, her voice a low, gravelly hum. "The one who served the bitter tea?" News traveled fast on the invisible network that connected the enslaved, a grapevine of whispers and secret signals. Abigail simply nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The old woman smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "The spirits of the water welcome you, child. You carry a heavy justice in your soul." From them, she learned the ways of the Gullah people, the descendants of Africans who had preserved so much of their ancestral culture in these isolated sea islands and marshes. She learned their language, a melodic Creole that felt more like home than the clipped, harsh English of the great house. She learned their stories, tales of trickster rabbits and flying Africans who escaped bondage by soaring back to their homeland. The stories gave her a new kind of strength, a sense of belonging to a history that the masters could not write or control. The mockingbird's song, her lullaby for Eliza, became a part of this new life. She heard it in the trees and realized it was a signal, a code used by the runaways to warn of approaching danger or to signal a safe meeting place. Her private grief was transformed into a shared language of resistance. When she hummed the tune now, it was not just a lament for her lost daughter, but a prayer for all the lost children, a hymn of defiance, sung in the heart of the enemy's land. But the outside world did not forget her. One day, a man named Cato, who sometimes risked a journey to the edge of town for supplies, brought back a piece of newsprint. It was a bounty poster. $1,000 reward ran away from the subscriber. On the 14th of June, a negress by the name of Abigail, about 30 years of age, 5 feet 4 inches high, of a brown complexion. She is intelligent and well-spoken for her kind, having served in the house. She has a notable crescent-shaped scar on the back of her right hand. She is wanted for the heinous crime of murder, having poisoned her mistress, and is considered extremely dangerous. The above reward will be paid for her capture and delivery to the Charleston workhouse, or $1,500 for proof of her death. Wallace Beaumont, Beaumont Plantation, Charleston. Seeing the words in stark black ink made her blood run cold. Extremely dangerous. They had turned her grief into a monster's caricature, and the price, $1,000. A fortune, enough to make any man, black or white, a traitor. The swamp was no longer a sanctuary. It was a closing trap. The fear she had suppressed for so long returned, a cold knot in her belly. The hunt intensified. Silas Croft, his pride wounded, had not given up. He hired a notorious slave catcher from Georgia, a man known only as Cain, a former tracker of Creek Indians, who was said to be as relentless as a bloodhound. They began to make forays into the swamp, their dogs baying in the distance, a sound that struck terror into the hearts of the hidden community. The runaways were forced to move deeper into the cypress maze, to more isolated islands of solid ground. The tension was a constant, gnawing presence. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves could be the sound of approaching doom. Abigail's sleep was plagued by nightmares. She saw Cain's shadowy form moving through the trees, saw Eleanor's ghost rising from the murky water, her face a mask of bloated revenge, the scent of jasmine wafting from her decaying form. One night, sitting by the low fire, Mama Juba looked at her, her dark eyes seeming to pierce the veil of Abigail's composure. "Them dogs is gettin' closer, child. That overseer man, he got a demon's nose for hate. You can't stay here. You bringin' the fire down on all of us." The words were not unkind, but they were true. Abigail was a magnet for the violence of the world she had fled. "There's a boat," Mama Juba continued, her voice a low whisper. "A gullah fisherman, he sometimes takes people north, up the coast, past the Virginia line. It's dangerous, but it's a chance. He leaves with the full moon tide, 3 nights from now, from a hidden cove they call the Devil's Elbow. 3 nights. A lifetime, and no time at all." The thought of leaving, of heading north, toward a freedom she could barely imagine, was both exhilarating and terrifying. It meant leaving this community, the first place she had felt a semblance of belonging since Eliza was taken. It meant a journey into the unknown, but she knew she had to go. She was a ghost in this land, and she could not rest until she had either found a true sanctuary or been laid to rest herself. She spent the next 2 days preparing, gathering dried food, filling a gourd with fresh water. The other runaways gave her what they could spare: a piece of cured meat, a heavier cloak, a small, sharp knife. They were small gifts, but they were given with a silent understanding, a shared prayer for her survival. On the 3rd night, under the ghostly light of a full moon that filtered through the cypress canopy, Abigail said her farewells. Mama Juba held her hands, her grip surprisingly strong. "You walk with the ancestors now, child. Don't let them catch your spirit, even if they catch your body." Abigail slipped away into the darkness, a solitary shadow moving toward the sea. The journey to the Devil's Elbow was treacherous. She had to cross wide, open stretches of marshland, where the moonlight left her exposed. She moved in bursts, from one stand of trees to the next, her heart in her throat. The baying of dogs seemed to echo in her mind, a phantom sound that kept her on edge. She found the cove, a small, hidden inlet shielded by a tangle of mangroves. The salt spray was on her lips, the roar of the ocean a powerful, liberating sound. But there was no boat. She waited, crouched in the shadows of the mangroves, as the moon climbed higher in the sky. The tide began to turn. Had she missed it? Was it a trap? The minutes stretched into an eternity. Doubt began to creep in, a cold, insidious poison. Then she heard it. Not the sound of a boat, but the soft tread of feet on the sandy soil behind her, and a low, menacing growl. She spun around. 2 figures emerged from the trees, silhouetted against the moonlit marsh. One was the lean, familiar shape of Silas Croft. The other was a larger, broader man, Cain, the slave catcher, holding the leash of a large black dog that strained forward, its teeth bared. "Nowhere left to run, Abigail," Croft said, his voice laced with triumphant cruelty. A lantern was lit, its yellow light throwing their faces into sharp, demonic relief. $1,000. You're worth more dead than alive, but the master wants to see you dance on the gallows. He wants a confession. Abigail's hand went to the small knife tucked into her belt. It was a pathetic weapon against 2 armed men and a dog, but it was all she had. Her mind raced. The ocean was behind her, the hunters before her. This was the end of the line. "It was you, wasn't it?" Kane's voice was a low rumble, like stones grinding together. "One of ours told us. Said you were headed for a boat tonight. Said you'd be alone." A betrayal. The thought was a fresh, sharp pain. Even here, in this last refuge, the master's power could reach, twisting fear into treachery. The dog lunged, and only Kane's firm grip on the leash held it back. Abigail stumbled backward, her heel catching on a root. She was trapped, but as she looked past them, into the dark marsh from which they had come, she saw a flicker of movement, a pinprick of light, then another, and another. Lanterns, like fireflies, were appearing in the swamp, moving silently, purposefully, toward them. Croft and Kane saw them too. They turned, their confidence momentarily shaken. "Who's that?" Croft hissed. The lights grew closer, resolving into a silent procession of figures emerging from the marsh. It was Mama Juba, Cato, and a dozen other runaways from the encampment. They were armed with cypress branches, cane knives, and old heavy farm tools. They didn't shout or make a sound. They simply advanced, a silent, implacable army of ghosts reclaiming their territory. Croft raised his pistol. Get back, or I'll shoot." No one stopped. The circle of lights tightened around them. Kane's dog, sensing the shift in power, began to whine, its aggressive stance turning to one of fear. In that moment of distraction, Abigail acted. She didn't run toward the sea. She ran toward them. She lunged, not at Croft or Kane, but at the lantern in Croft's hand. With a desperate swipe, she knocked it from his grasp. It fell to the dry ground, shattering, the burning oil spilling across a patch of dry sawgrass and pine needles. The flames caught instantly. A wall of fire erupted between Abigail and her pursuers, a roaring, crackling curtain of orange and yellow. The dry marsh grass went up like tinder. Smoke and embers filled the air. "The boat!" a voice shouted from the darkness. "It was Cato!" Abigail turned and saw it now, a small skiff sliding out from the mangroves, a single man pulling it silently through the shallows. She ran for it, plunging into the knee-deep water, the flames hot on her back. The fisherman pulled her aboard, his face a grim, determined mask in the flickering firelight. From the shore, through the smoke and flames, she could hear shouts, the enraged bellow of Silas Croft, the terrified barking of the dog. The fire was spreading, a wild, uncontrolled force of destruction, a funeral pyre for her old life. As the fisherman pulled the skiff out of the cove and into the open water, Abigail looked back one last time. The entire shoreline was ablaze. The silent figures of the runaways had melted back into the swamp, their work done. The small boat hit the first ocean swell, rising and falling on the powerful, dark water. The fire on the shore grew smaller, a fading orange glow against the vast blackness of the land. The scent of jasmine was gone, scoured away by salt and smoke. All Abigail could hear was the rhythmic splash of the pole in the water and the vast, eternal roar of the sea. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know if she would survive the journey, but as she sailed away from the burning coast of South Carolina, under a canopy of indifferent stars, she felt the ghost of a lullaby rise in her throat. She was a runaway slave, a murderer, a legend in the making. She was free. And she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Her fate now belonged to the tide. Epilogue, Knox, Charleston, 1892 *. The air in the archives of the Charleston Library Society was thick with the sweet, dusty scent of decaying paper and old leather. Thomas Hayes, a young man with a passion for history and a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose, carefully untied the faded pink ribbon around a bundle of letters. The Beaumont collection, he thought, had been a disappointment. Mostly dry plantation ledgers and vapid social correspondence. But this last bundle, found in a forgotten trunk in the attic of the crumbling Beaumont estate, felt different. The letters were from Wallace Beaumont to his brother in Virginia, dated in the years following his wife Eleanor's death. The early ones were filled with a raw, vengeful grief, detailing the hunt for the slave, Abigail. He wrote of the fire in the marsh, the escape, the frustration of the chase. He described Silas Croft's return, empty-handed and furious, claiming the witch had surely drowned or been taken by a gator. But Wallace, it seemed, was not convinced. As the years went on, the tone of the letters shifted. The grief curdled into a feverish, paranoid obsession. October 17, 1858. Asterisk. I see her everywhere, William, in the face of every new girl I purchase. I hear her in the songs the field hands sing. Last night I swear I smelled that damnable jasmine by my window, though the vines were torn out years ago. Croft says I am mad, but I know she is out there. A ghost, a devil, poisoning my life from afar. The plantation is failing. The crops are poor, the people are sullen and useless. She put a curse on this land with her evil. Her spirit haunts these fields. My 3rd, 1864, asterisk. The Yankees are near. The world is ending, as I knew it must. It is her victory, you see. She. Shattered my world, and now the whole of it follows. I often wonder about her child, the girl Eliza. I have no idea where the traitor took her. Perhaps she is free now. Perhaps they have found each other. The thought is a torment beyond any other. Knifed. The last letter was dated shortly after the end of the war. Wallace Beaumont had lost everything, his fortune, his land, his mind. He died a broken, penniless man, haunted to the last by the shadow of the woman he could not catch. Thomas Hayes set the letters aside, a strange melancholy settling over him. He had heard whispers of the story growing up, the poisoning at the Beaumont house. A local ghost story, a piece of Gothic folklore told to frighten children. But here was the raw, human misery behind the legend. Later that week, pursuing a thread of his research on Gullah spiritual practices, Thomas took a ferry to one of the sea islands. He found an old woman, nearly a century old, sitting on the porch of a small, weathered cabin, weaving a sweetgrass basket. Her name was Rose, and her eyes, though clouded with age, were sharp and intelligent. He asked her about the old days, about the stories passed down. He mentioned the name Beaumont. The old woman's hands stilled. She looked out toward the marsh, a faraway look in her eyes. Beaumont, she said, her voice a reedy whisper. That a name full of trouble? Thomas pressed, gently asking if she'd ever heard the story of a runaway slave named Abigail. A slow smile spread across Rose's wrinkled face. We don't use that name. We call her the Marsh Sister, the woman of the bitter tea. So it's true? Thomas asked, leaning forward, his historian's heart pounding. Some things is truer than fact, Rose said cryptically. They say she never got caught. They say the fire took her hunters and the water took her north. Some say she made it to Philadelphia and started a new life. Some say her boat went down in a storm, and her spirit came back to the swamp to watch over the runaway folk. They say if you get lost in the marsh, and you're runnin' from trouble, you might hear a bird singin', a strange tune, a song no real bird knows. That's her, the Marsh Sister. She'll guide you to safety. The old woman picked up her basket and began weaving again, a rhythmic, hypnotic motion. As she worked, she began to hum, a soft, tuneless sound at first, which slowly coalesced into a simple, haunting melody. Thomas Hayes felt a chill run down his spine. He recognized the tune. It was a variation of a nursery rhyme, a lullaby his own grandmother used to sing to him. A song about a mockingbird. He left the island that day with more questions than answers, the haunting melody following him back across the water. The official record would show a slave who murdered her mistress and vanished, presumed dead. But history is more than ledgers and letters. It is also the stories whispered on porches, the songs hummed by old women, the ghosts that linger in the moss-draped trees. The story of Abigail, and countless others like her, is a testament to a truth more profound than any single fact. It is a story of the indomitable will to survive, in a world designed to crush the human spirit. Was her act one of revenge or of justice? In a system as fundamentally unjust as slavery, perhaps the two are indistinguishable. Revenge is a bitter poison, but sometimes it is the only medicine available. Freedom is not a place one arrives at, but a constant, desperate, and often violent struggle. Abigail of Charleston, the woman who served the bitter tea, was never truly captured because what she represented could not be contained by chains or cages. It was the ferocious, undying hope of a mother for her child, the terrifying power of a soul that refuses to be owned, and the enduring legacy of a single, defiant act that shattered a porcelain world and echoed through the generations, becoming a lullaby, a legend, a whispered promise of freedom in the humid, jasmine-scented air.